We've all been huge fans of Indy and his adventures for a couple of years by this point, with almost all of the franchise's films being a huge part of our childhood. Though even a franchise as great as Indiana Jones has at times goofed up in a movie or two, just as much as some films from it are incredible. Let's talk about some of the best and worst movies from the franchise, starting with Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Let's start by talking about the film that almost all consider the worst out of the bunch. One of the biggest issues with this film is obvious. Even its opening frame shows a super distracting CGI groundhog that pops its head out of a mound. The franchise has always been more about a big adventure using effects that, at the time, can put our hero through the most dangerous situations out there. But a film with the character in the 21st century already started to feel wrong once the weird CG effects started to pop in, and it just gets worse from that point onwards. From Shia LaBeouf swinging along with an animated monkey to a bunch of CG ants that carry communist soldiers off to death. Sadly, an over-reliance on CGI is far from the only issue the fourth Indiana Jones film had. Even someone as talented as Cate Blanchett failed to turn the film's villain, Irina Spalko, into an interesting character. Not just that, but John Hurt is basically just a walking, talking clue pointer. Ray being a loyal sidekick doesn't matter since the character barely exists. And LaBeouf is performing too intensely, making it seem like he's in a completely different film. Additionally, more on Crystal Skull. The only character dynamic in the film that worked out was the one between Indy and Marion. Harrison Ford and Karen Allen have no problem slipping back into their old characters, finally giving the film a desperate boost as soon as it started to get dragged down by its insane plot. Though many people had a problem with the fact that the character was now up against aliens in the films, another film that was more like a religion-focused MacGuffin would have been a better option. But it still makes sense why Lucas and Spielberg wanted to take the story in this direction after taking the character to the 1950s. We don't have a problem with aliens, but the story they chose to tell with them. The hunt for the Crystal Skulls doesn't weigh it down. Fans just wanted to see the character take off on an adventure, similar to the ones we've seen before. The movie is not interesting, from the characters to the story and even the set pieces. It's all a big shame since the character is one of the most interesting heroes ever appearing on the big screen. It took years for Lucas, Spielberg, and Ford to finally pick up the franchise for another film, but maybe it was just best if they just let it rest. Maybe instead of struggling for a good enough narrative, they should have just left it alone. Next up, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. The two directors started working on the film relatively fast after seeing how successful Raider of the Lost Ark had been. Still, from the very start, they wanted to make a much darker and generally pretty different film from that as well. Lucas said he took the same approach with Empire Strikes Back as the darkest entry in the trilogy. Still, instead of being deemed an iconic film, it went to some emotionally hard places and turned more into a horror film, especially in its almost pitch black third act. Though the film does start out with a lot of promise, especially since it starts with a Busby Berkeley-ish musical number that's suddenly followed up by an intense and entertaining showdown between Indy and Lao She. But the hints of us being in for a bumpy ride start with Kate Capshaw's nightclub singer, Willie Scott. It makes sense that to avoid repetition, Lucas and Spielberg would want to change up the character's female companion. Since Willie Scott is the exact opposite of Marion Ravenwood, what happened was that the character was left with a rather grating, dim, and annoying narcissistic stereotype of a character. Similarly, a good movie. While her romantic interactions with our hero are set to recreate the tone of classic screwball comedy, movies, they mostly fail at doing so. If Raiders shows off the best influence James Bond had on the franchise, this film shows off some of its worst aspects, especially regarding the love interest/hero dynamic. Though our hero's other companion, Short Round, is much more endearing and easier to stand on the screen, not just that, but the chemistry between the two ends up making up most of the film's comedic moments. Something super important to balance out the much darker aspects of it in the second half. Spielberg embraces some aspects of the horror genre and B-movie cinema, which can be seen in the violent finale that caught many of us off guard. While Raiders had a similar, super graphic ending, it was much more balanced. On the other hand, Temple's final third act is full of pure shock content, whereas Raiders saves all the gore for the very end, making it much more worth it. Temple of Doom is far from a bad movie. It featured some of Spielberg's most effective set pieces in his career, with its booby trap sequence and a super fun car chase at the end. But having a strong companion and relying less on its darker tones, ultimately reducing its focus on the main character as an intellectual, turned it into an average film at best. Coming up, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. What's truly incredible about Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is that it almost acts as a stealth origin story for the character. At first, we see the character in another one of his adventures, but the film tells us more about where the character came from and what makes him Indiana Jones. Quite literally, the movie starts off with a much younger Indy, with the director showing his love for westerns throughout the film, which ended up being some of the character's main traits. All of that is happening in between a super entertaining and elaborate chase sequence. River Phoenix was the best casting choice for the character, and even the composer John Williams got super creative and made one of the best pieces of his career. Last Crusade is the most ambitious the franchise has gotten, with Spielberg and Lucas sending Indy off on an adventure all over the globe to find another super important religious artifact. But the adventure is just a facade. Furthermore, the crux of the story. The true meaning of the story lies in the character getting to know his father again and accepting the relationship he has with him, who, in a case of super accurate casting, is played by Sean Connery, James Bond himself. The dynamic between the two is perfectly executed, and while it's still combative, it's never mean. Despite their estrangement, they always pick up dominant or submissive roles in super subtle ways and evoke their entire relationship with just a look. The movie is also both Lucas and Spielberg's attempt at coming back from Temple of Doom. It replaces the Temple's dark moments for more comedy, snappy dialogue, and more intellectual moments, as seen in Raiders. Let's talk about Raiders of the Lost Ark. If we're being honest, The Last Crusade makes a really strong case for being the best film out of the bunch, but what gives Raiders of the Lost Ark the edge here is its consistent sharpness and top-tier filmmaking that knocks it out of the park. There's not really much we can say that's wrong with the film that brings out an adventurous thrill ride. Karen Allen's Marion Ravenwood is just as compelling as our main character and doesn't try to make a copy of the hero. Not just that, but the film thrives in the chemistry between the two. That, along with the mix of smarts, moxie, and luck that Ford brings to the table, is what brings the film to life. Indy is a unique superhero because he's almost always in over his head. He doesn't work his plan out 30 steps in advance, but despite thinking on the fly all the time, he still manages to get through anything. That's what makes him so enjoyable, since the audience doesn't know if he's going to survive. While he does always survive, it's a super close call each time. The image of the character always getting his hat at the very end isn't just a clever detail. It also shows off the character as a whole. He always makes it out alive and in one piece, but always by the skin of his nose. Finally, some Spielberg magic. Spielberg does an amazing job of setting up a hero and the entire world in the prologue, which takes some cues from Bond at the start, but with a set piece, he relates it to the rest of the plot. But we learn all we need about the character from the first sequence, and then the next one continues to flesh him out even further. We see the character is revealed to be a super smart professor at Marshall College. What sets him apart from the usual secret identity trope seen too many times in superhero stories is that the character's jobs and adventures are the same. He uses knowledge and action and doesn't need to hide one side of himself from the other. Looking back at the film now, it's refreshing to see how just good dialogue and character-driven movies can do as well as blockbuster films. Sure, it's another action-adventure film, but most of it is just humans interacting with each other rather than set pieces and explosions. And even the set pieces that the director includes add so much more to the movie, since they don't inject the audience with shots of adrenaline after shots. They show up at the perfect moments, and they're masterfully made and completely driven by the characters. That, along with some great balance between some of the best characters seen in the film, adds in a great dose of Ford's charm and vulnerability, and we're writing the recipe for some of the best films ever. That's a wrap for this video. Which Indiana Jones movie is your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this. See you in the next one.